It's time to begin our Bible class again. We're in 1 Corinthians. We have been looking at chapters 11 through 14. Haven't gotten to 12, 13, and 14 yet, but we're good there. Trust me. I have identified this as a section that is describing how Christians were to behave when they were together. Some of it clearly in assembly, others may not be in a specific assembly, but certainly tends to be rules and things that they need to look at when they are together. In the first part of 1 Corinthians 11, he deals with dress, particularly women's dress, to show respect to their husbands. And the latter part of 1 Corinthians 11, he deals with partaking of the Lord's Supper. And he starts with essentially the statement that leads us to believe that they thought they were partaking of the Lord's Supper, perhaps, but they weren't really doing it. So they were doing it wrong in a sufficient way or a sufficient amount that no, Paul was saying, no, you're really not observing it. He provides some direction on that. All right, Bill, you had a comment or question.
Yeah, this whole thing with, it has been reported to me by the house of Chloe, as it starts out. This is visible things happening. This is not the mind. People weren't observing mentally correctly. They were openly not observing the Lord's Supper properly. That's a comment I want to think about.
Okay. And verses 20, 30, which we read last week, he describes the nature of what we call the Lord's Supper. Again, I'll mention that by the 2nd century, most all the writers were referring to this as the Eucharist. Anyone know what that means? Thanksgiving. So it's not an unscriptural term. It's perhaps one that we push to the side later. For this, he is saying, just reminding them what it's about. And what is it about? Anyone?
Remembering the Lord's death.
Okay. And how do we do that? Or how are we supposed to do that? Let me rephrase that. Okay. But in specifically, what did Jesus do?
He reminded them that, or told them that eating this unleavened bread was symbolic of his body. And that when they drank the fruit of the vine, which would, of course, at that time been wine because they didn't have refrigeration.
Yeah.
But that was symbolic of his blood that would be shed in his death.
If we believe from the gospel accounts that even though he was partaking of it early, because he wasn't going to be alive on the Sabbath when they would normally have eaten the Passover, if he and his apostles gathered in a room and took the Passover meal. And at the end of the Passover meal, Jesus took a couple of the items that were part of that meal, the unleavened bread and the wine that they had, and gave them different meanings. Let me read it. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night in which he's betrayed took bread, which he had given thanks, and he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So here he's describing two items of food that were to be partaken to remind them of Jesus' death, specifically of his body, which was crucified, and his blood, which he describes here as of the new covenant. Now, he then gives them a warning. Don't eat or drink of it in an unworthy manner. And we talked about what that could mean last week. There's some, quite reasonably so, that argue if you're living in an unworthy and unrepentant manner, then you're partaking of the Lord's Supper to remind you of Jesus' sacrifice. When you're scorning that sacrifice through your life, that's an unworthy manner. Also, many would look at this and say, if you are eating and drinking this without thinking about what you're really doing, you're doing it in an unworthy manner. Now, for me personally, I think the latter fits closer to the context of the problem that they were having. But I can see quite both of them as being applicable here. And he says, this can cause Christians to be weak, sick, or sleep. Now, does this mean that they're not doing it properly, they're going to go to sleep during the middle of their meal? How would they be weak or sick or sleep? Yes, Becky.
It means that they were more like inactivated, their faith was not being expressed. And they were not alert and aware of what they were doing.
Okay. So think about it this way. If Christians are to partake of the Lord's Supper on a regular basis to remind them of the sacrifice that Jesus has made for you and me, what happens when we don't do it? What happens when we don't remind ourselves of that sacrifice? Brett.
We're likely to act in ways that we wouldn't if we were thinking about that sacrifice more reverently and more consistently.
Because isn't this the fundamental part of Christianity? So if we're ignoring it, and even worse, if we're taking a memorial that's specifically for that and just blowing it off, saying we're not going to be there, but maybe even worse, going through the motions, but not even focusing on what it is, that can be a symptom of a spiritual problem. And it certainly is going to lead to further spiritual problems. Now, many have argued that there's something significant about the Lord's Supper, and if you don't do this properly, that God is going to act on your heart and make you spiritually sick. I don't think you have to go to that extreme to account for what he's saying. Now, Bill, you had your hand up?
Yeah, last week, I don't know if you remember, I referenced Acts 20, verse 7, when the disciples came together to break bread. I view that, in my mind, that was a primary thing they had gathered for. We've added two things to the things we do on the Lord's Day, first day of the week. But everything we do, we have examples of it in the New Testament. It's not like we're doing things that we decided was a good thing to do. Whether it's singing, as Jesus and his disciples sang to him. And singing is also referenced in, I think, in Colossians. It's just preaching, of course, all till midnight, intending to depart on the morrow. I'm afraid sometimes we don't really realize that the reason we've come together is to observe the Lord's Supper, and then we do these other things along with it. Just a thought there.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought, but let's tie it in when we are looking at chapter 14.
Okay.
Because that's where he talks about some of the other things.
Right.
Now, I've referenced a number of times Jewish practices. And I do that because most Christians during the early part of the first century were Jewish. And even those that were Gentiles If you look at what Paul writes, Paul was expecting them to understand quite a bit of Jewish history and about the Jewish law. So as we look at this, it's important to see the ties to what the Jews have been doing before. And there's one case, in this particular case, you have the Passover meal. But Paul is emphasizing that this isn't like a Passover meal. This isn't there for a few people to get together in their homes or whatever and to have a meal. And yes, it had religious significance, and they devoted a significant amount of their time to that, including the singing of hymns. But there are going to be some differences here as far as partaking of the Lord's Supper. And I think it's important to remember that as he's describing this, their problem is they don't wait for one another. Or that, I should say, that is one of their problems. Another one appears to be they're treating it like a banquet or a full meal. And what does Paul say about that? What happens if you're hungry? What are you supposed to do? Okay. So you're not coming there to eat a regular meal. And we also talked about how, yes, we do find indications that Christians had common meals, especially in the first, second, and third centuries. There, you find, for example, in Acts chapter 2, yes, they met house to house. But of course, then you are in a pretty large group of Christians that, yeah, they use the temples sometimes where the apostles gathered to teach, but that would not have necessarily been an appropriate place to take a meal. So they did it from house to house. So,
John?
Yes.
Another aspect of that eating common meals from house to house is, for many congregations, it's not practical for them to meet in one place, eat a meal together, particularly a congregation with thousands of people. It's possible to have a Lord's Supper service with a lot of people because very little is required. But if they're going to have a full meal, a lot is required. And one of the things of having common meals from house to house is you break into groups. Not everyone has to be in one place when you're doing this from house to house. And so that way they get the benefit of having common meals together, which I think there's value, but in smaller groups that are manageable and in a way that doesn't bring things into the worship service that Paul here is saying we'll do that.
Okay. As we look at what we know about this passage, Christians were meeting together in Corinth to observe the Lord's Supper, but had gotten it really wrong. Different groups brought food, but did not wait for one another. You can almost imagine whether they were still meeting in the school that was next to the Jewish synagogue in Corinth, or whether it was someplace else. Maybe they were bringing their baskets with their dinner. Don't know. But some of them brought a lot of food. There were poor people there who couldn't afford to bring a lot of food. And so you have maybe some poor folks that have just bare minimum to eat. You have some other folks who are eating a banquet with each other in the same room, but not with each other. I guess is more to the point. They did not judge the body rightly, and as a result, many were spiritually weak and sick, and some had even fallen away. Now, be clear, Paul does not describe here whether their assembly to eat the Lord's Supper was at the same time as the assembly referred to in chapter 14 or not. We're not told, period. But we do have some other indications. And let me go ahead and go on to this slide. So, yes.
Before we leave that, I have a question.
Okay.
When it talks about body, they do not judge the body, like whose body is that? Is that the body of the church? Is that the body of the people? Was it their own body?
And I laugh because best I can understand the language, and I would appreciate anyone correcting me if I'm wrong. This is another area where the language isn't necessarily specific. We'd like to have language that was a lot more specific, but we don't. Again, personally, whose body can you judge? Or whose body can you discern? Let me put it that way. Your own. And so I think that's what he said here. But like a lot of things, I'm certainly not going to be very dogmatic about it because it can be read several different ways. Yes, Becky.
I didn't hear what he said.
Your own body.
Oh, okay.
Can you discern the Lord's body? Yeah, you can. But what does that really mean?
He starts the conversation now, talking about Christ's body.
Yeah, that's where he starts.
So they missed the whole point for a second. Like that was obvious, another question. And like you, I'm not going the same way. Not sure. But either way, one understand the conversation is referring to the fact that they don't discern Christ's body, right? Then they got a problem. But they don't understand why he died in the first place. And they're still fleshy in their behavior. And that's proven by the way they observe it. But either way one takes it, if we can't discern the fact that Christ died for our sins, and it was why it was necessary that he does it, then we still got a problem.
Yeah. So you have essentially the argument about this is representing Jesus's body and blood. Are you paying attention to what it means? Verse 28, let each man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So yes, there's something that you're supposed to be remembering, but you need to be examining yourself.
The change was the fact that he died for deliverance from sin,
Oh, sure.
so that we not walk in sin. So we better discern not only his body translated into our if you're going to call him.
Brent?
I usually think of this as discerning the Lord's body, but that's probably at least in part because I use the New King James, which says not discerning the Lord's body, which the word Lord's is not in the critical text. But that still leaves the question, is that discerning the Lord's body, which is the physical body which he sacrificed on the cross, which certainly is in view, or is it also, or instead, discerning the Lord's body in the sense that the body of the church is affected by how we conduct the Lord's Supper. And if we're not discerning the impact that our decisions when we come together have on the Lord's body in that sense, we're not rightly discerning that aspect.
And he's going to be talking about that, writing about that too. Isn't language a wonderful thing?
The ambiguity forces us to consider multiple possibilities, all of which have spiritual valuable application. And so some of that, I'm sure, is, at least some of it is intentional, I expect, by the author.
The other alternative to that is, this is something that we can get our mind tracked to. Sometimes people say, is it this or that? maybe it's all the above. You understand that? I think that could be the possibility.
That's
It all ends up pointing to the same
the
understand why he had to die for us and how significant that death was. And it should mean something. And it should mean something to them. And it's not a part of it. They didn't come together to have a big shindig. They came together to remember that he died.
and that's the key that we have here. It's not about having a big meal. It's not about satisfying hunger. It's not about you with your own clique partaking of it at your own time. It's not about those things. Yes, Brent.
This is only slightly related, but one of the things that the translators have to decide or may
Yeah.
do unintentionally because they're not careful is when there's a passage that is ambiguous and could be understood in multiple ways, the translators have to decide, am I going to translate this in a way that preserves that ambiguity, or am I going to resolve it in one way or the other because I'm sure that this is what was meant in context or not? And so sometimes the translators resolve some of these ambiguities for us, but in at least some places, I really appreciate responsible translators saying,
Yes.
if I translate it the way that is most in line with my doctrinal and theological assumptions, it actually, for example, there's a passage in Revelation that is very emphatically proclaiming Calvinism, especially predestination. If you resolve the ambiguity one direction, the other way of translating it just doesn't make any definite statement about predestination at all. So I appreciate when translators are restraining themselves and leave us to have, is he talking about, is it Jesus who was slain from the foundation of the world, or was it their names that were written in the book of life from the foundation of the world? And some translations will make it only be possible to understand it one way or the other. And so anyway, sometimes the ambiguity helps, sometimes it doesn't.
So the point there being, read multiple translations when you have a chance. All right. Getting back to this slide. Did Christians meet, or do we have any examples of Christians meeting more than once a week?
Yes.
Okay.
That's chapter 2.
So we find the early church meeting quite often. Many have argued, and I'll let you know I don't disagree with the argument, that the Lord's Supper is properly taken on the first day of the week. Why do we think that? That's right. Luke, in describing Paul and his companions' trip in Acts chapter 20, and we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days. And there we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began teaching them, intending to leave on the next day. And he prolonged his message until midnight. And there were many lamps in the upper room, and they were all gathered together. And of course, we know the subsequent miracle that was performed there. But Luke, as in his description here, it ends up being very specific. How long did they stay at Troas?
7 days.
Okay. And Paul and his companions left the next day. How often were they meeting together to break bread? There's really no other way you can read that other than that they were doing that on the first day of the week. Now, does that say they always did that? It doesn't say that. Do we have a reasonable basis to conclude that they did? I think so. And we'll combine that with several things that we have in First Corinthians, including when they were supposed to put together a contribution that they were giving for the Macedonians, which pretty much pins it to, yes, they were meeting on the first day of the week. But Paul he doesn't write it as prescriptively as maybe we would like for it to be. But the evidence is all there. So we certainly find from Troas, that's what they were doing. Paul had taught the gospel there. He had identified partaking of the Lord's Supper. And I think we could conclude here quite safely, that's when the Corinthians were in fact meeting together.
One thing, John, here, the meeting on the first day of the week, or as you see here in chapter 16, verse 2, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside. That implies it's every first day of the week. It doesn't say that, but when God said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, did they all say, which Sabbath? No, they knew it was the last day of the week, what we now call Saturday.
So Christians had, by AD 55 or so, they were meeting typically once to break bread. And we'll discuss later, did they meet any other times to study? But when they were doing this, wasn't on the Sabbath. They would have been used to when they were following the Jewish law. So what becomes significant about the first day of the week?
Jesus rose from the dead.
Okay. We've got the whole religious or Christian world celebrating today Easter because it's the first day of the week when Jesus rose from the dead. I put that together with the Lord's Supper. Again, remember his body crucified, wasn't it? That happened according to our calendar on Friday. And his blood of the new covenant. When did that come into play? He shed his blood on Friday. When did the new covenant come into play?
Jesus rose from the dead.
Does Christian baptism work if you don't have a death, burial, and resurrection? So there are logical reasons why they would have partaken on the first day of the week. And we find an example of them doing so. We find Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper on the night he was betrayed, consists of bread, cup, i.e. wine. Christians were partaking in remembrance and to proclaim his death until he comes. Why would we proclaim his death till he comes? Right.
We're supposed to live in that hope and offer that same hope to the whole world, as well as warning. It's both hope and a warning.
Yeah. But again, picking on the Bible lesson that we are working with on Wednesday, what is central to that? Jesus's death as a sacrifice. David.
I was going to say, I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
The death, burial, resurrection, if they hadn't raised from the dead, they hadn't died, none of it would have ended to be anything. So the whole point of it is to remember that what he did for them specifically in this case. And that's the key to the whole gospel, the whole good news. You have to continue to proclaim the fact that he died. So that for those who believe would save him from the wrath of God. When he comes back, save God from his wrath.
So when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we are remembering, I would argue, the most significant part of his ministry, his death as a sacrifice and his resurrection. Now we see here that, yes, we're supposed to examine ourselves. I didn't use the phrase where it said judge. I picked another verse. And there are consequences. If we don't evaluate ourselves correctly, there's judgment coming upon us. If we are correct in our self-evaluation, there is no judgment. We also see he's telling them to wait for one another. Why? Go ahead, Brian.
No, it's a collective action that binds us not only closer to God, but to one another as the body of Christ. Because if we're not doing it at the same time, that undermines that communal aspect of the communion.
Okay, so if we all came into the building at different times and sang, would that be edifying one another? If we decided to have individual sermons and Brent was to offer 12 sermons during the day and you come and hear a different one every Sunday, does that provide a benefit? Actually, yeah, it does, but is the part of the benefit that we're supposed to be focusing on. Why are we told to assemble? In Hebrews chapter 10.
For one another up to love and good works.
Okay. So it's about each other. I would also suggest there's another reason identified here. And that is, on the negative side, if you're not doing it together, you're hurting each other. And he uses the example of the rich versus the poor. The rich are there, and notice that for this, they're there at roughly the same time. Oh, yes, they started their banquet and they're having a big banquet, and the poor don't have much. Are they sharing in what they're doing? No. In fact, they're building up separation within their congregation and probably resentment, which works directly against what they're trying to do. And they're not to be doing this to satisfy their own hunger. All right. So if they're not to be doing it to satisfy their own hunger, and we're not to be some partaking a banquet and others not having much, how do we resolve all of that and what we do? I'm sorry, what?
There's a general understanding with the group that is gathering. They come with their mind set on, okay, we're gathering to partake, to be around like-minded people.
And most congregations today, the congregation provides the bread and the fruit of the vine. Is it wrong to bring your own bread and your own fruit of the vine? I don't think so, as long as it's not showy in such a way as to cause resentment with others. All right, you're not supposed to be satisfying hunger. So how much should you be eating? Sometimes I wonder when people get these teeny little crumbs, can they even taste it? Yeah, but the point is, it's not a banquet. Now, you may argue, okay, if you don't get enough there of the actual emblem, does it fulfill its function. And I think it's primarily mental rather than how much you eat. So there's a wide variation of what we could potentially do there. Bill, I think you had your hand up.
I think this kind of goes along with what we've been discussing here and you're waiting for one another and everything else there. In Hebrews, now, of course, the letter to the Hebrews written to Christians had been Jews, and they're now receiving some persecution and are kind of backing off the assembly of the saints and so forth. But then in chapter 10, beginning in verse 24, Paul says this, he says, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And then he also says, for if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. He ties sin right in with not forsaking the assembly of the saints. The point of it is we gain something when we're together. If we don't gain, maybe we're not judging ourselves rightly.
I would read that a little differently in that we have to focus on Jesus. He is our sacrifice. There is no other that we can go to. And in helping us to do, we should be meeting and exhorting one another. That, at least that's how I read that passage. But yes, we do have it is important for us to help each other. And I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, the climax of 1 Corinthians is chapter 13, where he's writing about love. In fact, starting from chapter 1, chapter 13 provides the answer for all of the reasons why he's telling them they should be doing things, starting from chapter 1. And no, we haven't gotten there, and we haven't talked a lot about it, but that's certainly a key part of this. And he's going to make, when he talks about the spiritual gifts, he's going to make the point again. So read chapter 13 periodically to remind yourself where Paul is getting to. Now, a couple of quick questions, and we could spend weeks dealing with this. But as we think about congregations today and what they're doing, and some of the disagreements, let me put it that way, that Christians have had. A lot of congregations meet twice on Sunday. And a lot of them offer the Lord's Supper twice on Sunday. Should they do this? Should they not do this? What are the arguments that are there?
Both ways.
All right, so we have the example of Christians meeting once on the first day of the week. So that did not seem to have been an issue for them. Brent.
I'm just coming from the position of I'm okay with if we meet twice, that we offer the Lord's Supper twice, but also being familiar with those who would have a problem with that. My understanding is that it's primarily has to do with the waiting for one another and the oneness and togetherness of partaking of the Lord's Supper, and the way that a second offering is often handled, or most often handled, which is an offering is made usually at the end of services. Is if anyone was not able to partake of the Lord's Supper, come forward or meet in a separate room after services or something along those lines. Most often it's at the end of the assembly. And so then the people who identify themselves as not having partaken raise their hand. People come and serve it to them individually within the assembly while the rest does not partake. And so according to this view, that's not the congregation as a whole partaking of the Lord's Supper, that's not tarrying for one another. That's some people doing one thing in the assembly and others doing something else in the assembly. And I think that's my understanding is that is the objection. If it were the case that, I don't know, if everyone was okay with partaking of the Lord's Supper twice and the whole congregation partake of it in the second assembly, then I think the objection about the second offering would not be there. But there's others who think that would be weird or maybe even inappropriate, since he was only sacrificed once for us to partake and celebrate his death more than once on the same Sunday. Know if there is a scriptural basis for objecting other than it's not traditional and would seem unusual. I don't know that I know of any congregation that offers it twice to the whole congregation.
Yeah.
That may just be.
I'm sure if we looked enough, we might find one, but.
It be considered inefficient or a waste of resources or something like that. But
And I ask this not so much to get into the weeds on, oh, this congregation's wrong, this congregation's right, etc. What are we trying to do? And we're in areas where there is no strong example, because like I said, outside of Acts or the early Jerusalem church that we find in Acts 2, 3, 4, etc., Christians met once on the first day of the week. Later, they're going to meet more often. But this is second and third centuries. So this wasn't an issue for them. It's not addressed. And sometimes we have to take the principles that are there and try to apply them as best we possibly can. And that applies also on our snow days. Can Christians who live near each other but can't go all the way to Roanoke have their own assembly? Now, again, I'm not encouraging you to, oh, this is right or this is wrong, but think about the principles that are there as we try to apply it to sometimes some difficult circumstances, or circumstances that are difficult because we don't find a New Testament analogy. Exactly. Yes, Bill.
Situation, I wrestled with this myself, but finally came to the conclusion that if someone was not able to be there at the morning service, morning assembly, I don't feel like I have the right to withhold them partaking of the Lord's Supper that evening when they are able to be there. That's up to them and between them and God. How I felt, I finally dealt with it.
Sometimes we can be a little more united if we approach things with a little bit more humility as well. I don't know how many times as I've studied the scriptures through the years, I've looked at something and come to a different conclusion. And so I can't conclude that I have all the right answers now necessarily, looking at the history of where I probably didn't have all the right answers before. And we all need to approach it that way, I think, as well. Thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate it. I had hoped to get in chapter 12 this week, but think about spiritual gifts for next week. Thank you.